so let's go to another little bit of Dharma wisdom here. Something that we also are all familiar with is the idea that pain is not the same thing as suffering. That suffering is what we layer onto the inevitable experiences of physical pain, of illness, of loss, of grief, of anxiety, of jealousy. And so we all have that inner voice, that inner commentary that has an opinion about whatever pain we're experiencing. What does that inner voice sound like? What is something that voice might say? Oh my God. It'll never stop. Why me? Yeah, so I just wanted to make sure, again, this is not just in my head, that you all have this voice. Good. Okay, so next slide. So there's a lot of research looking at how it is that practitioners experience pain that might be different than non-practitioners. So this study, which is led by Joseph Grant at the University of Montreal, took experienced Zen meditators and non-meditators and gave them all the exact same type of pain experience. So they were strapping onto the calf thermal heat that's going to be quite painful. And in sort of a point of curiosity, it turns out that experienced meditators need higher levels of heat in order to achieve the same level of moderate pain. So that's kind of interesting. Go ahead, next slide. Okay, so what you're going to see here is what happens, the difference between meditators and non-meditators in their brains while they're asked to attend normally to the experience. They're not meditating. The meditators aren't meditating. This is the new default. Okay, so next. What you're going to see here is that non-meditators show more activation in the evaluative regions, that default network, the typical default network. And these slices of the brain that you're seeing here, rather than pulling this half of my head off, it's like you're slicing me this way. We're going to pull the top of my head off and peer onto the inside. So this is the front of the brain. And what you see here, the blue parts, those are the areas of the brain that are more active in non-meditators. Okay, and you're seeing this is essentially looking like that default network that I showed you earlier. Meditators, on the other hand, next slide, what you see is the only area of the brain that is more active are the areas that are listening to pain. The areas of the brain like the insula and the thalamus that are just waiting to feel the pain that is happening, that are giving you perfect information about what is happening in your body. And yet, meditators were able to tolerate much more pain, even as they carefully attended to it. And I think those of you who have a strong practice will immediately recognize this is how we dissociate pain from suffering. That when we attend directly to the experience and turn off that inner chatter, suddenly the experience of suffering that seems to arise from pain starts to dissolve. Next slide. And within the meditators group, the greater the decoupling, the functional decoupling between these two brain systems, paying attention to the feeling of pain and making a commentary about it, the greater they were dissociated, the higher the meditator's pain tolerance was. Next slide. Okay, now, it is really important, I think, as a teacher of meditation, to notice that this is what happens in experienced meditators. This is a study led by researchers at Wake Forest University that took brand new meditators. They'd only been meditating for 4 days, mindfulness meditation. And when they were brought into the laboratory and given the exact same pain test, that heat stimulation to the leg, turns out that the successful meditators, those who could tolerate greater levels of pain, or found the pain less unpleasant, that they were doing exactly the opposite in their brain than what experienced practitioners do. They were inhibiting sensory information, that somehow they were shifting their attention to ignore what was happening in the present moment. And that was giving rise to less suffering, inhibiting awareness rather than carefully attending to. And I think those of you who teach recognize this as something that often happens when we start to practice. We accidentally end up doing exactly the opposite of what the practice is asking of us. And sometimes we experience what seems to be pretty good results. And I think studies like this can really give teachers insight into how that process is happening in the mind and in the brain so that we can better guide people through and beyond that. Next slide. Okay, so I want to show you now a very similar study that's just looking at emotional pain rather than physical pain. And so they're comparing brand new meditators with experienced Zen meditators in how they process emotionally evocative images that might trigger fear or that might trigger a kind of sense of distress and compassion. Next slide. And what you'll see is something very similar to the physical pain study. Okay, so what you're looking at here, this is one last type of view. Cut me from ear to ear, pull off the front of my face, and look right in. And what you'll see, I know this is a good thing you haven't had lunch yet, right? What you see here is an area of the brain that became deactivated in the new meditators, the amygdala. And this is kind of the first relay station of emotional information. New meditators are tuning this off, turning this down, less emotional processing. And you can see here, so beginners are here in this sort of orangey red. Okay, so when they are practicing mindfulness, they are not attending to the emotional experience that is arising. They are actually inhibiting it. Whereas in experienced meditators, there's no difference between when they are not practicing mindfulness and when they are practicing mindfulness. They're basically keeping this channel open of attending to emotional experience. Next slide. What they turn down, you can probably guess, is this inner commentary, this default network that we've been talking about for the last 15 minutes. Experienced meditators, they're deactivating that. New meditators are deactivating the actual direct experience of the emotions. Next slide. And again, I just think, when people sit down like this, you don't always know what's going on up here. But studies like this can be very helpful both in understanding what new meditators are doing. And also, I use studies like this. I now show this stuff when I teach beginners. And in a way, it's a little bit like a stick that's waking up a sleeping practitioner. And that people who really had no idea what I was asking them to do with mindfulness, that they were going into this instinctive strategy of shutting things out rather than opening to them, they see brain pictures like this. And again, it is almost like that koan, where suddenly we realize that there's a gap between how we're functioning in the world and how we might function in the world. And just that knowledge of that gap can allow us to progress in our practice.